This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is movie serials. We'll be talking with two experts about the history of the format, why it died off, and if there is anything in the 21st century that is an equivalent. The subject is old-fashioned movie serials. I have two people who will be discussing the history of the form and how it played out and if there's anything equivalent today. On the left of the screen, I have Ed Hulse. Ed, I'd like to give everyone a little bit of time to talk about who they are, what their relation to the subject is, and so forth. So if you could give a little bit of background about who you are and your history with movie serials.
Sure. I'm pretty much a lifelong fan of serials. I started watching them on television when I was 9, 10 years old, back in the early 60s. They were still running on New York television at that point. And I was a big fan of a magazine called Screen Thrills Illustrated, which was published by James Warren, and it was edited by two film buffs and collectors named Sam Sherman and Bob Price. Well, I got to know both of these guys when I started collecting 16 millimeter film in college, and I started buying prints of old serials, which was not easy because they were very rare. You either had to get old beat up TV prints that had been junked, or you had to buy what they called dupes, which were substandard copies that were made from original prints. And it was a very expensive process either way. So I started doing a lot of research. I joined a film society in New York City, that was populated by the most fascinating group of film buffs and historians and authors that you could imagine. I mean, on any given night when we were running complete serials in one shot, there would be William K. Everson, who authored many books on film, Alan G. Barber, who really got serial fandom going in the early 60s. John Cacci, who wrote a book called Second Feature, which was mostly about B movies and some serials. In any event, these guys, hanging out with these guys, watching all these serials, both on TV and in 16 millimeter, gave me a pretty good background. But unlike a lot of my fellow hobbyists, I was very excited to research them. I was fascinated by the form. So I started researching them when I was still in my 20s. I started going to film festivals where some of the serial stars and directors were guests. And I managed to interview a lot of them. This started in 1973 or so. And I met a lot of guys who were just terrific guys, the stuntmen, the stars, the leading ladies, directors, and writers. Some of these people I became friends with over the years. Flash forward a few years, I became a professional journalist, and my training in reportage enabled me to approach my research with new skills. So I started researching more extensively with the idea of writing about them. And I did lectures occasionally, participated in college level courses on film where serials were discussed. I did lectures in libraries, things like that. In 2002, I began a magazine called Blood and Thunder, which was about all things adventure, mystery, and melodrama. So naturally, serials were covered a great deal in that. So I started my own publishing company called Murania Press, which is itself a serial reference. Murania is the underground kingdom in Gene Autry's The Phantom Empire, 1934 mascot serial.
Yes, I was just thinking about the Phantom Empire. But go ahead. Sorry.
No, so I published Blood and Thunder. I regularly publish serial articles there, and then I collected those articles in two books that are still available: Blood and Thunder's Cliffhanger Classics. There's a volume 1 and a volume 2. Then about 10 years ago, I started seriously writing what I considered my magnum opus, a 2-volume history of the silent movie serial. Mm-hmm. The first volume is called Distressed Damsels and Masked Marauders. Mm-hmm. Second volume is called Handsome Heroes and Vicious Villains. So all of my books are available on my website, which is muraniapress.com. And I became something of authority in this line, and I wound up becoming a panel moderator at film festivals and conventions where some of the remaining serial stars appeared. I mean, that's the kind of thing I've been doing up until the last 5 years or so. So I'm still at it. I'm still writing about serials, although at this point, my 2-volume silent serial history, that runs to more than 250,000 words, which I believe is more than everybody else together has written about silent serials, at least in commercial books. So I don't know what else to do, but I'm constantly learning things. I research the old trade papers. I occasionally come across items with facts that I didn't know. So I'm still at it. I'm still an enthusiast, and I collect them now on DVD, and that's where I'm at.
Before I turn to Guy, just a couple of questions from what you stated. Was there also a serial called The Purple Phantom? Because I remember something about I remember seeing there was an undersea kingdom. Was that something?
Well, Undersea Kingdom, the two serials you mentioned, I think The Purple Phantom, I think you're referring to The Purple Monster Strikes.
Okay, yeah.
A 1945 Republic serial about an invader from Mars. The Undersea Kingdom was one of Republic's first serials. That was released in 1936, and that's about Atlantis.
Okay. And since you say you grew up in New York, I know I started watching serials in the early to mid 70s on the public television channel, Channel 13, WNET, where they'd have Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers and stuff. My dad was a big Buster Crabbe fan. He was born in 1916. But there wasn't any public television when you would have started. What channel did you see them on?
I saw them on WPIX, which was Channel 11.
Yeah.
At that time, it was still an independently owned station. Yeah. And they ran most of their serials on a afternoon kiddie show hosted by a guy named Officer Joe Bolton.
Ah, okay.
And he basically hosted, this was a show where they ran a Three Stooges short, some cartoons, and a serial chapter every weekday afternoon. And what he would do is he'd cut away from the end title, which typically said, see the next chapter at this theater next week. Well, you weren't seeing it in the theater, so he'd cut away from that. And what he would do is he would then read a code message, which when you decoded it was the title of the next chapter. So by decoding the message, you knew what you were going to see tomorrow. Okay. So, and then there were other kiddie shows, two other independent stations, WOR Channel 9 and WNEW Channel 5 also occasionally ran serials. But that's between those three stations in the early to mid 60s. I saw probably two dozen serials complete. And that really kicked it off for me.
Okay. On the right side of the screen is Guy Barefoot, and unlike us, he is from the UK. So could you give a little background about your interest in serials and maybe how UK serials might have differed from US serials, or were there just UK independent serials?
The quick answer to that is no, not really. But basically, to give you my background, basically, I probably should say how I didn't come to this, because I didn't grow up watching serials. I mean, the nearest I had to that when I was in the 60s was probably watching episodes of Doctor Who on television. The first encounter with serials probably was later in the 70s, in the wake of Star Wars, when the BBC in England started showing sort of Flash Gordon and some serials then, sort of early evening. But I basically was pretty ignorant of serials until around about 15 years ago. So I'm Associate Professor of Film at the University of Leicester in the English Midlands. And I came to that really through studying the form of melodrama, but in some ways where melodrama was taught in rather different sort of ways, in terms of domestic, in terms of the weepy or whatever. But I was interested in other forms of melodrama, and in particular the way in which how the film industry used the term melodrama in a very different way. And that's how I sort of got drawn to serials, and realizing that they were a particular form of melodrama, and also realizing both that it was a big area that I knew nothing about, And two, in terms of a certain type of film history, apart from the very early serials, the sort of Perils of Pauline and Pearl White serials, they didn't really feature in film history at all. It was almost as though they didn't exist, or that they were sort of relegated to the idea that these were sort of shown on matinees and that was it. So I started to look at it and I became fascinated with them. Partly I was fascinated in the audience. Who were watching these? And the idea that was it just kids' matinees or was it something more than that? But also that they seemed to be a very different form of film narrative, really, of nature of cinema that was quite different from what I was used to. So about 15 years ago, I started to research them, mainly, really, essentially the sound era. Sort of the book I published, The Lost Jungle, was on sound serials with some material on looking back to the sort of the broader history of the serial, both in print and in on film as well. But the main focus was in the sort of period between 1930 and really 1946, which was when Universal stopped making serials, and it was really left to two studios, Republic and Columbia.
So instead of just going back to the beginning of film series, let's talk a little bit about the idea of melodrama and serial fiction to get put it in a sort of historical context. And I'll start with you, Guy, because here in the U.S., I, for example, was turned on to some U.S. soap operas when about 40-some years ago by my sister, and I've been watching them, here and there, and there's, very melodramatic. But that's an art form that's dying here in the U.S. There are only 4 major U.S. soap operas now on television. But I know in the U.K., Coronation Street and other serials such as that, since you mentioned Doctor Who, at least the early Doctor Who's, is serial drama or serial fiction even now in the form of the soap opera? Is that going away, or have you studied that?
I haven't focused on that. I mean, it exists in different forms. I mean, it exists on radio. We have this thing called The Archers, which has been a long running radio serial that's been going on for decades. And I think, that's what's interesting about the serial form. It appears in very different ways, and so that the soap opera is largely a sort of an open serial, something that can go on ad infinitum, as opposed to the film serials, the sort of films that the Public and whatever made were basically, they were within a set time frame, sort of 10 to 15 chapters, and within a narrative, and that's something quite different, really, I suppose, from the soap opera format.
Yeah. And outside of soap operas on television, here in the U.S., a lot of dramatic shows in the last 15, 20 years have become more serialized, even sitcoms. For example, back 40, 50 years ago in the U.S., there were shows like The Odd Couple that they were just self-contained episodes. And oftentimes you would have chronologically things were askew within that little universe. Whereas nowadays, if you watch any television shows, dramas or whatnot, they all have taken the serial format. And let me go to you, Ed. Have franchise movies, for example, become the new serials? The Marvel Universe, the Star Wars universe, the Star Trek universe, all of these things, have they taken the place of movie serials, do you think, Ed?
No, I don't really think they have. I think they're still legitimately considered series. Like, for example, the Tarzan movies with Johnny Weissmuller had the same characters, Johnny Weissmuller and Maureen O'Sullivan, and later Boy with Johnny Sheffield. But they were all complete in themselves. And even though they came out at fairly regular intervals every year or two, you couldn't really call them a serial in any real way. What the analogy I would draw is really the cable TV dramas on networks like HBO, Showtime, and occasionally even some network dramas, where you have a limited number of episodes, usually 10 or 12, and in the fashion of the last 10 years or so, each season of one of these shows, take, for example, Dexter, if you've ever seen Dexter, which was about a serial killer.
Yeah.
They just wrapped one of those up on Showtime.
Yeah.
Each season of 10 or 12 episodes has its own storyline, has its own principal narrative with the same basic characters, and each episode is dependent on the previous one. So there are no cliffhanger endings per se, although I can't even say that. Sometimes there are situational endings which are end on a suspenseful note designed to bring you back the next week, which of course is exactly what the serials were all about, the movie serials. But I would say that shows like Breaking Bad, Dexter, even The Sopranos to some extent, this idea now, Billions, which is a show about Wall Street finance, they have specific stories that occupy each season, and then they begin a new story the following season, and it runs through those 10 or 12 episodes. So I think that more than the kind of Marvel movies you're talking about, I think that's the better comparison.
I guess there's a similarity here in the sense that it's breaking out of the sort of the standard format, the idea that of a film which is sort of 90 to 2 hours long or whatever. But it does it in very different ways. I mean, yes, I think the HBO serials and programs, and that's one of the reasons why the subject has come into attention again. But they are they're using longer time formats to explore complexity in a way that the film serials of the 30s and 40s were not doing.
So let me ask you, Guy, how did the serial film emerge? Was it just a logical extension visually of the magazine serials of the 19th century, where you had Charles Dickens writing his books that way? Things like Varney the Vampire, which was a 1,000,000-word novel that was written in like 1,000-word increments that went on for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Or was it simply the studios needing fodder to get people in the seats back for the A films that they did that? What was the genesis then, Guy?
Well, it's true that in the 19th century, serialized fiction was very significant. I mean, you get the development of a sort of mass market industry, and you get a lot of long novels that are published in serial form initially, and some things which are only published really in serial form or only later as a single volume. So you do, you get Dickens, you get other forms of penny dreadfuls or whatever. So you get a regular output, and that's an earlier form of seriality. But again, some clear differences. Sometimes, again, of people who are writing sort of long novels, but with a slow pace, basically, sort of, and publishing in monthly installments rather than weekly installments. You then, and actually, I probably might have to defer to Ed on some of this, because I think you publish more on this than certainly than I've looked at. You get the development of the dime novel. You get other forms of mass market fiction, and that does link up with film in a sense that as film develops in the 20th century, as it's looking to move to a sort of longer format, so sort of very early films are sort of one reel long or whatever, they're very short. As filmmakers are thinking about making longer films, they do that in different ways. Partly they go towards the series in a sense. One other way is towards what becomes known later on as the feature film, the longer film. But another way of getting people to come back to the cinema is to make sort of a longer narrative in serial format. And there is, in a number of cases, very close links with publishing then. So some of the earlier serials are released to tie in with serialized publication in print, newspapers who published Perils Pauline, in print as well as at the same time as they appear on the screen. So there are direct links in that sense, just as later on the serials pick up on comic strips, radio, whatever. So it is tied in with other formats, but it develops in a particular way in the cinema.
So I want to end this first segment just asking you, Ed, are there any comic serials? Because could something like Charlie Chaplin's Tramp, could something like the Great Stone Face of Buster Keaton, the Keystone Cops. Could their films be considered serials since they often involve the same kind of antics and the similar kind of mayhem, and then things and with people just walking away laughing or something? Or did the serial develop an initial or a strong imprint different that makes it melodramatic rather than can be comic?
Yeah, I would say no, that the kind of comics, the Chaplin and Keaton kind of comedies you're talking about, would not qualify as serials even remotely.
Mm-hmm.
There are two primary influences, at least to the American silent serial. The first was, you alluded to, dime novels, which morphed into pulp magazines, which were all fiction magazines printed on coarse pulp paper that appealed to a very broad audience. And the fiction in those magazines was often melodramatic, very heavily skewed to adventure, mystery, and later even science fiction. So stories from the pulp magazines and the type of fiction in the pulps was one primary source for the early serial makers. The other, which is almost totally forgotten today, is a form of stage melodrama called the 10-20-30 melodrama. Now, why 10-20-30? Because those were the admission prices. This was a type of mass market theater, live theater, that was very popular beginning in the mid-19th century all the way up through the early 20th century. Kind of its, I would say, its high point was around the turn of the century.
Was this part of vaudeville?
No, these were legitimate theatrical productions.
Okay.
With 3-act plays with stories, sometimes more than 3 acts, but they had the types of tropes, narrative tropes, that we associate with serials. To give you an example, the idea of the female heroine who loses one or both of her parents in the beginning and has to either find her father, avenge her father, get her father's property that's been stolen from her. The concept of the hidden papers, whether it's a will or a treasure map or a deed to a valuable property. The idea of trapdoors and sliding panels. So many of the things that are in the later serials were popular in these 10-20-30 melodramas, which, by virtue of their status alone, could not be considered part of legitimate theater the way a Broadway play would. The Broadway plays, even in the early 20th century, were a little more upscale, whereas the 10-20-30 melodramas, I'll give you the perfect example. A kind of cliche that's associated with serials is the idea of the woman strapped to a log and being, driven towards a buzzsaw.
Yeah.
Well, that was actually done on stage in a melodrama called Blue Jeans. And oddly enough, it was the leading man who was strapped to the log, and it was the leading lady who had to come in at the last possible second and shut the machinery off.
Yeah.
Well, oddly enough, this was done, I still can't believe it, but by all accounts, it's true. This was actually done live every night. There would actually be a buzzsaw. It wasn't a trick buzzsaw. Now, maybe later they replaced it with something, but that buzzsaw had to be turned off every night by the leading lady. So that became known. The early serial makers, when they came up with the concept of what we call cliffhangers, and cliffhangers came along a lot later. The terminology they used to end an episode with that kind of life in peril situation, they called a blue jeans finish. That was how they originally referred to what became the cliffhanger ending. So it was these two sources, the blending of character types, plot lines, settings, and of course the promise of continual action. And of course, I should also say, in addition to the action, a concomitant lessening of characterization, which would distinguish a more adult theatrical presentation. So that's how we got to serials. Now, in the early silent days, what made the serials really popular was the fact that since they were dominated by easily recognizable character types and clear, crisp action, they could be seen by the immigrant class. They weren't, the immigrants were not, who couldn't read English. The story did not depend on a reading of the titles to carry the story. They could figure out what was going on just by seeing the character types and the types of situations that they were placed in. So that's really how the whole thing got going. Now, if you want to, later on, we can talk about the business aspect of this, in that the serials originally started to promote newspapers, believe it or not.
And I'll let you get into that in a bit here, but I would assume that's how we got the mustache twirling, villain too. Guy, do you have any comment before we end this first segment?
No, I mean, I suppose picking up on that, I mean, that was also a reason why the serial was very exportable. It didn't only have, American serials did not only have an audience within the US, there was a massive audience in Latin America, in India, in Europe as well. It was a form. It was based on something that was almost at the essence of the movies. It was based on movement and action and situations, and because of that, it could appeal to a wide audience.
So, Ed, you had mentioned in the previous segment about the development of the whole buzzsaw thing, and I mentioned the mustache twirling villain that ties the girls down to the railroad track kind of thing. So you get these archetypes, if not stereotypes. You get these archetypes that are built in. Were the first serials, because as I had mentioned, I first got into them watching the Mongo, Flash Gordon, kind of serials of the 30s or whatnot. But were the first serials just always the damsel in distress, the perils of Pauline type of serial?
I wouldn't say always, but predominantly, at least for the first 3 or 4 years. The serial that most scholars consider the first true serial as we know it, the first one to have cliffhanger endings, for example, is called The Adventures of Kathleen. And it takes place mostly in India. It was shot in 1913 and early 1914. And it starred a woman named Kathleen Williams, who had been making a lot of serial-like complete 1 and 2 reel subjects for a company called the Selig Polysoap Company, which started out in Chicago and ended up in California. It was one of the first studios in California. And there was a lot of jungle action. A lot of chapters had Kathleen imperiled by tigers, elephants, whatever, in addition to assorted East Indian characters. And that was originally started as a ploy to boost the circulation of the Chicago Tribune newspaper. Because in those days, especially the Sunday newspapers in big cities and even medium cities had Sunday supplements that printed fiction occasionally. So again, the whole point of serialized storytelling in a commercial sense is to get people to come back and consume the next installment, whether it's an installment of a radio show, a TV show, or even a newspaper. So you wanted them to keep buying that newspaper every Sunday, so they would write fictionalized versions of each chapter. And typically in the early years, we associate serials now with Saturday matinees. Typically in the early years, what would happen is the printed version of a chapter would appear on a Sunday in the Sunday paper, and the chapter itself would then appear in theaters on Monday. So, and by the way, the early serials were not always weekly. Kathleen had bi-weekly or fortnightly installments, and so did The Perils of Pauline, which is often thought to be the first of the weekly serials. No, the original chapters were released at 2-week intervals. So it was, a lot of it was about, and most of the early serials, by the way, did have newspaper corollaries. And what was done to make them even more appealing to readers is a lot of time the movie studios would hire relatively famous fiction writers to write these prose versions of the film serial chapters. Now, these are guys that are all forgotten today, but for example, Harold McGrath was an extremely popular writer of thrillers and adventure stories. He wrote Kathleen, The Perils of Pauline, which, by the way, I printed at Murania Press. I've printed the entire book-length version of the prose version of The Perils of Pauline. That was also part of this this trend. So a guy named Arthur Stringer, again, totally forgotten today, but extremely popular in the teens and 20s. He wrote The Iron Claw, which was the serial that gave us our first masked hero. So this sort of thing was going on, and it was strictly a commercial phenomenon. I mean, to pump up newspaper circulation. It certainly worked. In the case of Kathleen, it bumped the Chicago Tribune circulation by 10%. So this is why it kept going. And the Tribune, as a matter of fact, would run one serialized novel after another as fast as serials could be made by the various companies.
So let me turn to you, Guy. We often hear about American cultural imperialism or hegemony, and Hollywood is often to blame. Were serials sort of the herald of that coming? Or because I mean, we did get Charlie Chaplin over here, but it seems from what you said earlier that a lot of it was mostly American serials that came to the UK. What was the first serial that you know of that came to the UK, and was that sort of part of that Hollywood hegemony?
Well, things like Perils of Pauline and Adventures of Kathleen, they came to the UK as they came to a whole load of other countries. I suppose it does have to be said that there were European serials, that, you know, there are things like Fantomas and Le Vampire, Louis Feuillade, which are, again, there is a complicated case because in some ways they're series, they are often self-contained narratives, but there were serials, at least in the silent era, that were produced outside the US.
Was there I know that Dr. Mabuse films that came in Germany before the Nazis was sort of, you know, a franchise, but was there a Dr. Mabuse serial?
There was another film that Fritz Lang was involved in, Spiders, I think.
Yes.
That was a serial. I mean, what I think the difference is that in the US, the serial developed, at least over time, into quite a set format, while in Europe, there was a greater variation. You know, when they re-released, how long they were, whatever, and the serial didn't really survive beyond the silent era. So you do actually in the 20s, you get more prestige French films, which are released in serial format. So there was some sort of serial production outside America, but certainly it was an area where the US dominated. And yes, I think it's true that it was a big export market. I mean, obviously it's not only serials, it's other fields, but I mean, Pearl White was an international star. You know, whether that was in Asia, whether that was in America or Europe. So the serial was big international business, and that went on in the sound era as well.
So you said,
can I jump here, Dan, for a second?
Just 1 second. I just want to ask. Did you say that the serial format in Europe they stopped making it, or were you watching, you know, the 1930s sci-fi, you know, and gangster serials in the UK from the US as well? What you know? I just want you to clarify that.
I mean, they didn't. It didn't last beyond the silent era.
No. Okay.
I mean, you get. I mean, for instance, in the 30s in France, they make a version of Les Miserables, but that's a sort of 3-part sort of mini-series almost, a rather different sort of thing. But you didn't get that sort of regular production of serials in the way that did continue in the US. I suppose that's partly because it was based on, you know, the fact that it was produced in a regular way, that it was an industry that was based on you know, regular production.
Okay. Go ahead, Ed. I'm sorry.
So people still watch. I mean, and coming back to your earlier question, I suppose, yes, you know, there was an audience for serials. Well, you know, up to the sort of relatively recently in some ways. Sometimes it was an audience of children, sometimes it's an adult audience, and in different countries where sometimes they would watch the serials in different formats. So sometimes films that were released in 12 episodes in the US would be shown in a single or two sittings in another country. It was a very adaptable format in that sense.
I had to go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just amplifying Guy's point here about the different formats. The reason that serial chapters were the length they were here was, again, strictly a commercial consideration. When serials got started here around 1913, 1914, the feature film had not yet taken hold. A lot of the theaters still ran daily programs of combinations of short subjects. Most of them would try to vary. There'd be a comedy short followed by a Western short, maybe followed by a newsreel, followed by a serial chapter. And this was the dominant form of film exhibition in the United States until started to change with around World War I, 1917, 1918, as World War I drew to a close. The actual term feature, which we associate with a longer film, that's actually a vaudeville term. And early serials were actually called features because they were the feature attraction. In other words, the headliner in a vaudeville program, the biggest star on the bill, he'd be called the feature attraction. So the early serials, because they were the primary attracting force of those particular programs of short subjects, they were known as features, and they grossed accordingly, and they played in very big theaters. And consequently, that's why some of the early silent serials were produced on a much larger scale and for much more money, costing much more than their sound era counterparts.
So the mythos that these were B films, basically, or that somehow serials evolved into B films, I mean, they started out as basically A films, then, what you're saying.
Well, I mean, that terminology didn't exist, but in terms of their importance to the program, yes. They got the biggest posters outside the theater. As a matter of fact, the phenomenon of billboard advertising of movies began with the serial. And for a very simple commercial reason. In those days, most theaters, and again, we're still talking about the Nickelodeon era in 1914, most theaters would change the bill at least 3 times a week. Some of them changed the bill every day. So there was no point in putting up a billboard, which is not easy to put up or take down, to advertise a film that's only going to be there for 3 days at most. Whereas a serial was going to be there 15 weeks or even more than that in the silent era. So that made billboard advertising feasible. So, yes, up until around 1920, by 1920, maybe even a year or two before that, the feature film had become the dominant source the dominant element of a nightly or a weekly program. And the idea of just running short subjects and a whole evening's worth of short subjects, that kind of receded as we got into the 20s.
Well, and I suppose just to add to that, I mean, although you're right, it did change, but then the program still is significant later on. So that there are a lot of cinemas that we have a tendency to focus on. Well, what's the feature as we understand it? Sort of, the film that's 90 minutes long or something like that. But say in the 30s, where cinemas were showing a program, they were showing either maybe a double bill, but also with other material. Could be a serial, could be a comedy short or newsreel or something like that. That what people watched was often a program rather than simply going to see a film.
So let me just ask this then, and I'll start with you, Guy. From what Ed was saying, did the feature, as we've come to know it, the Cecil B. DeMille spectacle, the D.W. Griffith longer films, did they fundamentally change the way serials were made? Did we go from Perils of Pauline to, a different thing there?
I mean, I suppose these developments were taking place at the same time, so that we have a period when we have both the serial being produced and we also have longer films. Did it affect the serial? Well, I mean, I'm not sure whether this is quite answering your question, but I guess although it's certainly right that at the beginning the serial could be the feature, but over time it does become more associated with something that's sort of excluded from the sort of the first run houses. It becomes more associated with the neighborhood cinema, whatever. It becomes more associated with something that's on the bill rather than the prime attraction.
They weren't playing in movie palaces, in other words.
Well, not when I mean. I've mainly looked at the sound area, and you do get occasional instances where a serial does get to sort of a first run house, but on the whole, they have more of a market in the sort of the so-called neighborhood cinemas, the places where they're further down the run, which don't have the prestige, so they're not they are a less prestigious form of cinema by that time.
Ed, your comments?
Yeah, the serial in a way doomed itself because its adherence to the format was so rigid that when feature films came along, and again, as Guy was saying, these things, it's not so cut and dry. The cinema and cinema storytelling was evolving all during this period of the teens. But what happened was, as the grammar of film became more sophisticated, and as filmmakers came up with more efficient ways of telling their stories, they tried more ambitious subjects. So they would license popular novels, best-selling novels, best-selling Broadway plays. Even in the silent era, when you were dependent on titles to carry the dialogue, the feature films got a little more ambitious. Now, some of them, like the Westerns, were pretty much carved in stone. But the serial, with that adherence to the tropes of 10, 20, 30 melodrama and Pulp Fiction, they became less prominent. They became less desirable to adult audiences, especially. And they gradually, especially in the 20s, that's where you see them kind of boiling down into the very elementary form that they had for most of their life, and it's the same thing with their box office potential. As the number of theaters decreased, the number of theaters that would play serials decreased, the budget had to come down because to maintain the same margin of profit, producers had to find ways to cut corners. So, for example, you had a phenomenon. The most expensive serial ever made was Gloria's Romance, which starred Billie Burke, former Ziegfeld girl. You'll remember her as the Good Witch from The Wizard of Oz. She had only made one film before that, and it was a huge hit. On the basis of that, a producer decided, well, if she's that big, if she can draw that big for one feature, I'm going to put her in a 20-chapter serial and get 20 admissions out of it. So he made Gloria's Romance. That cost $960,000 to make, partially because Burke insisted on the best of costumes, the best of props, the most elaborate sets, and a longer shooting schedule than most serials had. So at that time, they could make their money back. Gloria's Romance was not a massive moneymaker, but it did earn that $1 million cost back, amazingly enough, because in those days, the serial was still that big in 1916. By the time you get to like 1927 and 28, you're finding serials that are made for as little as $40,000. So you can see the decline in prestige had a tremendous effect on what serials became and how much you could profitably spend on them to make your money back.
And just to emphasize the point that Ed's making, I mean, we had to remember that when you're talking about that lower budget, we're talking about something that's much longer than 2 hours longer, basically. So the actual, that's a cost that has to cover more shooting than you would get for a standard A film.
let's arrive now at the sound era guy, and I'll start with you and then go to Ed. It seems to me, just looking cursorily, that we went with the arrival of sound. We sort of morphed from the perils of Pauline, the romantic melodrama, to it seems just a few kinds of serials that must have been more, are either more popular or just stick in the memory more. I would put them as being there. I think there were a few westerns, although I think by that time John Wayne and the Western B film was emerging. So I don't know if there were that many westerns. There was the sort of Dick Tracy crime uh, uh, serial, and then there was sort of the sci-fi comic serial, which sort of you get the Zorros and the Batmans, and they sort of emerge from what you had mentioned earlier about the pulps, the Doc Savage kind of character. Is that so? If I'm correct? How, am I correct? And how did that morph from the Perils of Pauline to, the Buster Crab Batman type of serial of the 1930s that's so familiar?
Well, one in terms of westerns, yeah, there were a lot of westerns serials. That was a standard, a significant number, and that continued throughout the history of the serial. I mean, what is generally known as the first sound serial, The Indians Are Coming, was a western. So there were a number of westerns. There were jungle films. There were, as you say, crime films. Over time, what you get then is a different link with the publishing industry, and you get versions of comic strips, and that's where things like Flash Gordon comes from, or you get linked with radio, which is where the Lone Ranger, which I suppose is another example of a Western serial, and you get this strange blend. I mean, you mentioned Morania. I mean, you get this really weird serial, The Phantom Empire, which is a singing cowboy science fiction serial. So you get this strange combination of different elements, and quite a number of films in the 30s and afterwards have a science fiction element, as well as the sort of Flash Gordons where it's sort of going to outer space.
And did serials become more masculine too, as we went from Pauline to crime, Dick Tracy or whatever?
I mean, I suppose early on you get the so-called serial queens. You get these sort of films made around a single female character, although it's normally in a very masculine world. It normally is one woman, or sometimes one or two women, but otherwise it's a male world. There's some move to sort of revive that in the sound era, where we get things like Jungle Girl and whatever. But largely, it is often sort of largely a sort of what is male characters dominate the narrative, I suppose, and the same maybe with crime films, whatever. But also, I suppose what you're getting there is that sort of curious way in which there is an attempt to go back to earlier serial formats. It's quite consciously sort of an older form of storytelling, which they are appealing to.
Ed, your comments?
Yeah, just taking up where Guy left off. The kind of narrative tropes that I mentioned of the 10, 20, 30 melodramas, you can still find that well into the 40s. Again, it's true that while the heroes were generally more masculine, the concept of the girl who's looking for a missing father or who's trying to recapture a parent's legacy in some way or another, that goes way up. I mean, and part of this is because this is something else that isn't often discussed, especially at Universal. The people who wrote, produced, and directed the serials mostly came from the silent era. It isn't until just the last few years of Universal serials that you start getting a younger breed of creative person. But even these people grew up on and were weaned on the old-fashioned serials. But for example, the chief producer at Universal was a guy named Henry McRae, Well, he went back to Universal before there was a Universal. In other words, when Carl Laemmle was still running shorts programs with a dozen different brands, McRae was producing one of those. He started out with Westerns, he did Jungle Pictures, then he got involved in serials around 1915. So a lot of these ideas, you know, these guys would get put in charge of a unit because, frankly, by the sound era, the studios like Universal and Columbia, they didn't want to be bothered. They wanted to farm out the production of the serials. Republic was a different case because the serial was such a bread and butter property for Republic that they created their own dedicated units, and there was front office participation beginning at a very high level and working its way down. So the serial unit there was very much, you know, a part of the entire studio's. I'm fumbling for the right word, but it was very much a part of the whole studio program. Whereas with Universal and Columbia, the serial was another short subject. They were making cartoons, they were making comedy shorts, especially Columbia, and they didn't want to be bothered, so they would farm out production of the serials. So in Columbia's case particularly, the emphasis became on licensing popular characters from other media, whether it was comic strips, comic books, radio, or pulp magazines, and they would invest most of their money in buying these rights, and then they'd make the serials generally as cheap as possible.
And that would be
now sometimes
that would be
really
Batman, Zorro, Superman, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, the Batman and Superman serials were pretty cheap,
yeah.
And what saved them was the fact that they had such built-in audiences, and that's really what the studio was most concerned about. Because the bigger the audience was for something, whether it was from comics or radio or whatever, Superman's case it was both, all of the above, really. It almost didn't matter. They were able to secure bookings in advance just based on the popularity of the character. And as Guy mentioned earlier, some of the later serials that played first-run houses, it was typically serials that had these characters. The Flash Gordon serials, especially the first one, played some first-run houses. The Lone Ranger, which was Republic's most profitable serial, that played first-run houses. And Superman, certainly. The first Dick Tracy serial played first-run houses. So you did occasionally get these crossovers. And again, going back to your earlier point, these are mostly masculine heroes, but a lot of the situations, like I say, well into the 40s, after the war, after the Second World War, you start seeing more science fictional elements. So that kind of 10, 20, 30 plotting and character types, that kind of recedes into the background after World War II. And that's when you start getting things like the Commando Cody, you know, the Rocket Man serials and whatnot, Flying Discmen from Mars, stuff like that. And Universal finally quit the business in 1946 because they were undergoing a complete change in strategy. They merged with a company called International Pictures and decided that they were only going to do A movies. So they canceled all their B movies, their B Westerns, the Sherlock Holmes series canceled. They canceled the serials. It turned out to be kind of a bad decision for them. But a few years later, television came in, and television had a big effect on the decline of serials because a lot of the early ones went to television, you know, as early as 1950.
But from what you're saying, and you can pick, and Guy can comment too, is there was already a division between the Prestige and the Poverty Row studios. It seems that the serials got relegated to the Poverty Row. Is that correct?
Yeah, because first of all, the majors never wanted to be. I mean, it's interesting. Every major studio, with the exception, well, I can't even say RKO. Every major studio made at least, or released, I should say, at least one serial. MGM released a serial back when it was still Metro Pictures Corp. Paramount released a couple of serials. Fox released 2 serials in the silent era. But yes, it was primarily Universal and Columbia were not then considered major studios. The big 5 were MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, Fox, and RKO. Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, which was primarily a distribution outfit, They were considered mini majors, the three mini majors. As such, they didn't have the big theater chains. See, that's another thing. That's another thing that drove the serials, the quality level of the serials down to these neighborhood houses and in the small towns and the rural communities, was the fact that these companies didn't have their own theater chains and therefore did not have access to many of these big first-run theaters. So they had to book very inexpensively at the cheaper theaters, and mostly by the sound era, mostly for Saturday matinees.
So
yes, yes and no. I think that when I started to look at this territory, and started to look at local newspapers, and I just became conscious then of the number of cinemas in the 30s, say, that would be showing a serial sort of Friday, Saturday, whatever. There was there were the sort of the neighborhood houses, the action houses, or whatever, in which it was still part of the bill, basically, as well as specialist kiddies, batties, and that sort of territory.
So, Guy, let me just ask you to then. I wanted to speak a little bit about the actors that were used in serials. It was mentioned earlier how a big star could be born early on, but it seems to me that by the 30s or so, the actors that became the big stars, like a Buster Crabbe within the serials, they were not going to ever make the jump to the A pictures, or at least not in any kind of substantial way. So, from the actor's point of view, Guy, what I guess work is work, but what were the pitfalls of an actor, or even maybe a director working in the serials? Would you get ghettoized?
Yes, I guess so. I mean, you did get a mix sometimes of people on their way up and people on their way down. I mean, in the sense that, so John Wayne appears in serials before he has bigger success. Well, he has appeared in a major picture before, but I mean, you get an interesting contrast between Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. And Karloff starts out in low budget films and makes a number of serials, makes films for Mascot before going on to become more of a major star with Universal. Lugosi becomes a big star with Dracula, but then sort of goes the other way, goes downwards in terms of the serial. And you sometimes get some quite distinguished actors who appear in serials, and one of the cost-cutting measures that serials would develop would be to have the villain pay them a bit more, but shoot them for a more limited time. So therefore, you're not drawing on too much in terms of the budget in that sense. So you do get some sort of variety, but yeah, you get some people who, as you say, become more ghettoized and stick within that area.
So Ed, you had mentioned television. I recently watched a couple of videos about American International Pictures and how they in the 60s took the lead, and they would have these very cheap films that was sort of made in the same kind of spirit as B films, and also how the Hammer films in the UK sort of did that on that side of the island. I saw an excellent video about the history of the British B film too. So let me just I'll start with you, Ed, and then go to Guy. What influence, if at all, did television finally just kill off the movie serials? And did the people who worked in those movie serials, did they end up working in what we now consider B films, like made by the AIPs and the Hammers?
Well, the serial actors that we're most familiar with got their start in the 30s and 40s. They weren't really products of the TV era, but the answer to your question is yes, television did kill off the serial. Now, it had been dying for quite a while. It was not a quick transition. Just to give you an example, in the early days of serials, 2/3 of the American theaters played serials. That percentage dropped steadily to the silent era. By the time sound came in around 1930, only 35 to 40% of American theaters still played serials. And that dropped a little more through the 30s and 40s, so that post-World War II, you had fewer than 25% of American theaters running serials. And it was simply a fact that they had exhausted the potential. Once all the major properties had been licensed, all the Supermans and the Batmans and you name it, once they'd all been licensed, there really wasn't much justification for making these things, because it got harder and harder. Because one thing, the studios were never able to increase the revenues. In most of the sound era, a theater could rent a serial chapter for $5. Now, in some cases, they could rent them even cheaper than that, because if a theater owner booked them well enough in advance and he booked enough of a product, he'd get kind of a combination rate where he could get chapters for as little as $2 or $3 a piece. In Republic's case, if you owned a theater chain and you booked all of Republic's films that year to run in your theaters, you got the serials for free. So as costs went up, we also have to remember during the early 50s when TV came in, the unions in Hollywood had become progressively stronger during the 40s. So just the bare labor costs of making a serial shot up tremendously. And if you, at a certain point, the amount of money you're making and the amount of profits you're going to realize from your investment, it just doesn't work out. So TV was not only running some of the earlier serials that they were renting. By the way, sometimes they were just bootlegging them. There were a lot of serials on early TV that had title changes, and they were strictly the results of unscrupulous guys in labs pirating them and counting on the fact that nobody would recognize what they were. But also, Republic released half-hour versions of its serials in 1951 to television. So, yeah, I mean, TV really killed it. And a lot of, to answer your other question about B movies, it's actually better to say a lot of the serial actors and B Western actors wound up in television. Buster Crabbe, oh man, there's a lot. Ralph Byrd, who played Dick Tracy, wound up doing Dick Tracy on television. So you had a situation where a lot of the types of material that kids were paying money to see in the theaters was available on TV for free. So it was a combination of all these different forces that finally drove the serials out of business.
Guy, your comments on television?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think, you're right in terms of a combination of forces. I mean, the serial industry did depend on a sort of a regular stream of films to keep it going. So come 1946, when Universal gets out of the serial business, it's just left to Columbia and Republic. In the 30s, there have been other small companies that have come and gone, but they'd all disappeared, basically. So it was just the two companies producing serials. And I think maybe in the short term, that was they could gather more of the market, but in the longer term, that made it more difficult to sustain. I guess you also get maybe a difference in terms of the nature of cinema going. The sort of neighborhood theater, which depended on the idea that you would get people who would go to the same cinema on a regular basis. As you get greater mobility, as you get a rather different demographic, that becomes more difficult to sustain. So all those factors, as well as the expansion of television, did mean that I suppose what it meant was that the serials that were made did become even more formulaic, did become, were reusing material again and again. So they became, less appealing in that sense. So it was a series of different factors that led to eventually, sort of in the latter part of the 1950s, no more serials being made.
I was just thinking as you were mentioning, and also Ed had mentioned pirated stuff. There's that well-known, I think it was in 1941 or 42, the movie 1 Million BC, where they have the Gila monster and whatnot as dinosaurs fighting, and that shot has been used in like 100 other movies or whatnot. Were there really actually some scenes that from the Dick Tracy or these other serials that were used in later B films over and over ad nauseum?
Yes, I guess so. But I mean, the other side to that was, of course, that the serials themselves would make massive use of stock footage. The Universal was known for sort of reusing footage. You would see the same shots, and towards the end, you get even the cliffhangers get reused in different serials. So it is just important to remember that this was filmmaking on as cheap as possible a basis.
Yeah.
So if you can do that within a film, it's another way of cutting down on costs. One other way was the so-called economy chapter, for instance. The idea that you would have a one chapter where you would have material you've used from earlier on in the serial, which you would then repeat with the justification that you need to remind the audience what's going on in terms of the narrative. But even the time, you would get people complaining that this is just reused footage. So, yes, the footage was recycled both within the serials and, I guess, in particular examples, outside the serials.
So let me just talk about sort of the afterlife. Once the serials were gone by the mid or late 50s, Ed, you said in the early 60s you'd found out about them a decade or so later. I was watching them with my dad, and it seemed to me that public television was probably the only place that you could see it. Here in New York, for example, when I grew up, I'm not in New York now, but you probably remember the Joe Franklin show where they show old-time Chaplin and Lloyd and Keaton things too. That kept it going. So what kept what were there cultists who liked all these serials and would show them the way we have now modern day conventions? Because I know about the 1980s there was a company called Movies Unlimited that had VHS cassettes that released quite a few of these serials. So Ed, you probably know more about this in the U.S. So go ahead.
Yeah, the short answer to your question is yes. There was the serial was kept alive by virtue of the people who grew up with it and retained a fondness for it and weren't willing to let it go. So let me go back to one point you made. It's true that while in the major metropolitan markets like New York, Chicago, serials were pretty limited and kind of restricted to the exposure you're talking about on public TV, where they were considered kind of nostalgic, looked back in an earlier era.
Yeah.
However, serials were more popular in other parts of the country on television. In the South, for example, where serials and westerns were enormously popular, they were playing on TV there well into the 70s for everybody to see. So what happened was, as these things disappeared from TV, the first revolution came with the 16 millimeter film collectors that I talk about. You would not, it's a movement that's never gotten a lot of publicity, mostly because for so many years it was illegal to own these prints. But there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of film collectors who would buy this stuff because in the days before video, if your TV station didn't run them, that was the only way you could see them. And these guys published little magazines called fanzines. My friend Alan G. Barber, who I mentioned earlier, he published one called Screen Facts. Alan was probably the greatest serial fan that ever existed. He wrote several books on the subject, including Days of Thrills and Adventure and Cliffhanger. But he also published Screen Facts and various other one-shot publications, all of which had the aim of keeping serials alive in the minds of the people who grew up with them. So between the fanzines and also newsstand magazines like Screen Thrills Illustrated, which I also mentioned here earlier, they were written by film buffs for a general audience, but always with an eye to other film buffs saying, hey, we know what the good stuff is. So it was a combination of things. Now, was it enough to spur a nationwide revival? No, not really. But it was enough to keep the things alive and to keep the 16 millimeter prints in circulation so that by the time companies like Movies Unlimited came along, Movies Unlimited, which ran outside Philadelphia, they were pretty active pirates. I mean, they had a pretty broad definition of what copyright protection was. And a lot of the serials that they would sell on VHS had been transferred from 16 millimeter prints owned by collectors of serials. So in that way, the collectors played a very real part in keeping these things alive long enough so that they could get to video. So what happened is, in the early 80s, when companies like Movies Unlimited were making money with these things, Republic Pictures had their own home video department. They took notice and they said, we've got this whole library of things. We should put them out. We should be making some of this money. So that's when they started putting their stuff out, first on VHS and then later on Laserdisc, if you remember Laserdiscs.
Yeah.
So they kind of kept them alive. And now in a more recent era, we have a company called VCI Entertainment. Well, VCI started out in Tulsa, Oklahoma as a company called United Films, which was owned by a father and son team that were themselves film buffs and themselves serial lovers. And they liked the stuff and wanted to keep it in circulation enough that they legally licensed 16 millimeter rights to the 4 Dick Tracy serials and to Drums of Fu Manchu, all of which were classic Republic serials. So they made legitimate prints because they were paying licensing fees and royalties. So they helped keep this stuff alive.
Well, it should be said that Movies Unlimited, whether they were pirates or not, did a service, and there's often times when copyright stuff, fails because you just have to look at the archives. A lot of the studios. We mentioned Doctor Who. How many Doctor Who episodes have faded because the people there didn't realize what they had on hand? So, Guy, let me just ask you, especially since you're in the UK, what effect on the serial revival or the sustenance did the 1-2 punch of first Star Wars and then the Indy Jones films have worldwide, if any?
Well, first of all, just coming on that last point, because when I started looking into this, I was sort of assuming that a lot of these would have disappeared, but no, I'm largely because of collectors and whatever that they're still around. What affected? In terms of interest in serials themselves.
Yeah, because both of them famously, point to the growing up with watching the serials, and that Star Wars with Han Solo, and then especially the Indy Jones stuff, with the same actor, as homages.
I guess I'd have to say it's very different in the UK in that we haven't. Partly, we haven't had those sort of television channels which are showing older stuff. We currently have a channel called Talking Pictures, which is a sort of example of what you get more in the US, and they currently have a regular Saturday morning slot where they're currently showing Young Eagles, which is a particularly low-budget independent serial from the 1930s. But there hasn't been either through television or even what's commercially available through DVDs or what was VHS before. So when I had to find copies of serials, it was largely from the US or elsewhere. So there wasn't a sort of market for that. Obviously there was the interest in Star Wars and in Raiders of the Lost Ark and other films that quite clearly drew on the serials. But I don't know to what extent that sort of, there is. I'm sure there's still a fan basis, but it is a rather different situation outside the US.
And then what did Lucas and Spielberg's interest help with the quote unquote movement to maintain the art form?
Yeah, they did. Especially Raiders of the Lost Ark. As a matter of fact, one of my first published pieces as a professional journalist was for a magazine called Video Review, which was a consumer-oriented newsstand magazine about new video releases. When Raiders of the Lost Ark was released on VHS, my editor said, you're interested in these old movie serials. Why don't you do an article on the ones that are available on VHS, and we'll run that. So that was back in, I think it was 1982 that Raiders came out on video after it had been in the theaters. So it was around that time, and that was one of my earliest published articles. So it certainly helped me, but more importantly, it did stimulate sales, and it did stimulate interest. And if you'll remember, Dan, back in those days, there were a lot of news stories, both in national publications and regional publications, about, you know, hey kids, here's the Indiana Jones of your father's era, you know, and or grandfather's era, and then they would do articles on the serials. And there were some people that actually got interviewed. Some of the old serial people got tracked down and interviewed, and you know, they were saying, ah, yeah, we did it all 30 years ago. We did it 40 years ago. You know, these guys are just ripping us off. But yes, there was interest. But again, it was not a serious scholarly type of interest, although serials now have attracted that kind of interest. But a lot of it was a nostalgia-oriented phenomenon. You know, it's like, oh, this great fun stuff from Saturday matinees, you know. And that did, Raiders especially gave it a big kick along those lines.
Well, I'll always take Ming the Merciless over Darth Vader any day. But let me just ask a few questions here to wrap things up. Number one, since we were talking about some of the studios, did the studios have any, not only genre differences within, but did they have stylistic differences in the way they approach it? Because some of these serials looked more film noirish than others. So let me start with you, Ed, and then we'll go to Guy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There were differences, especially in Universal. Now, Universal for many years, as I told you, was under the influence of Henry McCrae, who went back to the early silent eras. However, around 1942-43, he was getting to be older, and his activity diminished. And some of the writers became producers of serials. At that point, they changed the format. For example, instead of having text cards to introduce the events of the previous chapter, they would actually film new dialogue scenes where characters would stand around and basically talk to each other about what had gone on in previous chapters. So that was one difference. Also, the Universal period serials of that 1942 to 46 period were less interested in the kind of fast action and dynamic stunt work that you saw at Republic. Now, Republic had really honed the craft of action filmmaking to a very fine level. They had the best stuntmen. They had the best second unit directors, which is something that's not often spoken of. And they were willing to spend the money to produce action scenes that would really and things like the miniatures, which we should have talked about before. You know, a guy was talking earlier about stock footage that got into feature films. The Republic miniature department was second to none in Hollywood, and there is footage of Republic serial cliffhangers that I have found in black and white feature films into the late 50s. And one I looked at not long ago was a British film from 1956. I think it's called Postmark to Danger. And it's got the shot from chapter 1 of, I think it's The Crimson Ghost, where a car sails over a cliff and blows up when it hits the ground. So with these resources and with the skill that they had and the talent that they developed, Republic concentrated a lot more on the action, on the car chases, on the fist fights, on the elaborate stunts, whereas the Universals of that mid-40s period seemed to be more talky. Not to say they didn't have any action, but a lot of the action they did have. As a matter of fact, some of the last Universal serials actually bought stock footage from Republic. So there's actually a couple of shots from Republic serials in Universal serials in 1946. So there were the stylistic difference. Now Columbia, and this is a long conversation we don't have time to get into. But when Sam Katzman, who was a legendary low-budget producer, started producing the Columbia serials, he came up with a bunch of ways to eat up footage without having to stage expensive scenes or lengthy dialogue scenes. And if you'll notice in some of the mid to late 40s serials, there will be long sequences of characters walking back and forth. Somebody will say, oh yeah, I left that over in the shack and woods. And there will be a silent scene that'll go on for maybe 30 seconds just showing these characters walking through the woods. Now, again, that's not a major thing. A lot of people don't even notice it. But people who are familiar with Sam Katzman's serials notice that there's a lot of them where there's this kind of meandering around to no point. In other words, they could have had an optical effect showing them walking out of one door and into the next. But they didn't do that. They ate up 30 seconds of footage by having them walk and doing nothing through the woods.
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier I'd seen this video about British B films, and you probably know this guy, is that in the 1920s and 30s they would have I forget the term they used, but they would have a lot of these scenes where someone would be pouring tea for 30 or 40 seconds because I think the British government subsidized the films by the length of the films.
Well, you're talking about quota quickies there.
Yeah, right.
Legislation was brought in to ensure that a certain proportion of the films shown in cinemas were British, which has been sort of mocked, although there were some interesting examples of that as well. So you obviously get low budget films, not just in the US, and there are big variations. And we haven't really talked about the independent serials and the sort of in the 30s where there were a number of small companies that made maybe one or two or small number of serials, and you do notice the real paucity of budget in some of them. But just to pick up on what Ed was saying, was in terms of, yes, I think maybe more than in other aspects of filmmaking, Republic in particular did really develop their own identity. They emphasized sort of efficiency and action, and they really pared that down. And that's why, in some ways, that the reputation of the serial does survive, because some of those Republic features, some of those Republic serials do really sort of, they are more formulaic, but they actually sort of are sort of expert examples of filmmaking that really do stand up.
Okay. Well, before I end, I want to ask one final question, and then I want to ask you both for your versions of the best and worst serials, the Citizen Kane of serials and the Plan 9 of Outer Space of serials. But the question I want to ask is, and I'll start with you, Guy, what do you know as the longest serial that was ever made in terms of episodes? Because I mentioned Varney the Vampire as now became a 1 million+ word novel. And one of the interesting things about some of these magazine serials, and you probably know too, is that sometimes the plots would change midway, or a character might be killed off in chapter 17, and then in chapter 40 they'd be back because the actual readers loved that character and they wanted them brought back. Did that ever happen in a serial that ran long enough that instead of this 13 chapters of Dick Tracy or whatnot, there was a 50-chapter serial and there was a character killed off? And did the studios ever say, we got to bring him back by chapter 30 and whatnot? So was there ever any case of that in a long-running serial?
Well, I think in some ways Ed might be better qualified to answer that, because it'd be more relevant to the silent era, where you do get more extended serials. Basically, in the sound era, you didn't get anything longer than 15 chapters, and certainly with Republic and elsewhere, it would be more planned out. So it wasn't like Dickens writing, Little Dorrit or whatever, and responding to what the audience was coming back at the same time. So the longer ones were more early on, and later on they become more structured and don't go beyond a certain length. But Ed, you might have something to come in there in terms of examples of silent serial where that might be relevant.
The longest U.S. theatrical serial was The Diamond from the Sky, which was a 1915 serial released by the American Film Company of Santa Barbara, California, that went 30 episodes. In the early days, it was not uncommon for serials to go 20 chapters. A number of the Pearl White serials, once she became a big star, even beginning with Perils of Pauline is originally a 20-chapter serial, although we only have half the footage surviving from a 9-chapter European edit. But there were a lot of 20 and some more than that. Universal, for a curious reason, settled on 18 chapters as a standard length. and they had that for many years. But what finally happened in the early 20s, the exhibitors complained too much because they said, what's happening is our audiences are losing interest. So they'll watch 9 or 10 chapters and then they'll get bored and they won't come back. So that was a big problem. So they did away with the 18-chapter serials in the mid-20s, and they settled on 12 to 15. But in the late 20s, the actual standard length was 10 chapters. And everybody, for a while, ran 10-chapter serials. Pathé, Universal, and the various independents were 10 chapters. During the sound era, they went up to 12 and 13 and then 15. Why? Was there any real narrative reasons for that? No. Again, it was commercial. And the reason was the extra rental that they got from the extra 3 or 4 chapters helped defray the extra cost of sound recording. So it was really that simple. It was always about the money. And that's pretty much what happened. Now, there were some serials that were very short. There was one serial, the title of which escapes me now, was 4 chapters. Pathé did a serial in 1919 called The Terror of the Range. That was 7 chapters. So a lot of it had to do with the earnings potential, because there were a lot of silent serials. Again, this didn't happen in sound, but in the silent serials, they would shoot 1 chapter a week, which is not the way they did it. Later on, they shot everything according to location and then edited the footage into chapters. They would shoot 1 complete chapter every week. So if these things went into theaters and they were doing really well, a 15-chapter serial would be extended to 20 chapters while it was still in production. Now, the earliest example of this that I know of was Pearl White's The Iron Claw, which was announced as a 15-chapter serial. It was phenomenally successful, and around halfway through, they extended it to 20. The last time that happened was in 1928. Universal did a Tarzan serial, Tarzan the Mighty, which was announced as 12 chapters, and because that was so popular, they extended it to 15.
But now, was there ever a character that ever came back within a serial because it was popular, or did they just say, well, this character is so popular, let's give them their own serial next year?
They weren't major characters, and occasionally, it was more often than not, it was due to editing errors. In other words, in a Western serial, there might be a barroom scene where a guy gets shot in chapter 7, but then they do another scene in the bar in chapter 13, and there he is standing at the bar. But that's really just a continuity error. That wasn't a deliberate attempt to bring the character back. So I'm not aware. I can't think of anything like that happening.
Because what I think of is like television, where Happy Days started out about Richie Cunningham, but the Fonz became, the star of the show eventually. I was just wondering if there was anything similar to that. No?
Not that I can think of offhand.
Okay, so let me just end then by asking you, well, first off, I will link to Guy's university page. I'll link to Morania Press online for people wanting to see that. So let me ask you, Ed, and then I'll ask Guy, what do you think was either the best made or the most exciting serial that you know of, and what was just a piece of direct that they never should have done?
Yeah. A lot of these things are very subjective. They come down to personal, taste. My personal favorite, what I think is the apogee of the sound serial, is Republic's Drums of Fu Manchu, which is not as heavy on the fist fights and the car chases and all that as the others, but it has a better plot. It has a linear plot rather than just a series of isolated incidents. It's got a good cast. It's got an excellent Fu Manchu in the person of Henry Brandon. And I think it's just a really top-notch production. Unfortunately, it goes 15 chapters. Probably should have gone 12 because the last few chapters are a little bit padded back and forth. But up to that point, it's really an amazing movie. And that's really my favorite sound serial, although I have a number of others that would come very close. In terms of the worst, that's another tough one because I can find something that I like in almost any serial. But I would have to say, and Guy mentioned this before, Young Eagles to me is really dreadful. Really dreadful.
Okay. How about you, Guy? What's your best and worst?
No, I agree with that. I mean, there is an element there that I would combine the worst and the best. I mean, at least sometimes there is something endearing about the sort of the problems of the serial. I mean, I have an affection, say, for the mascot serials, which were very cheaply made and often really totally absurd. But they have a sort of charm to themselves. I like them both, and they're very different from, say, although Mascot then became part of Republic and they led into the serials of Republic, they were very different, and they are just quite fantastic. Yeah, there is a sort of, I have to say, a sort of surreal element to them, which I enjoy.
Well, I want to thank both of you for spending an hour and a half or so speaking about this old art form, and hopefully some people watching this will look at them. And I have seen actually there are a few websites that actually do have the whole serials online, of whole serials. So anyone can Google that. So again, Ed and Guy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.